Spring 1943. For nearly 2 years, the rising sun had ruled the Pacific sky. From the Philippines to New Guinea, Japanese pilots flew with a confidence that bordered on certainty. Their Mitsubishi A6M Zero was light, graceful, and seemingly invincible. At the war's beginning, it outclimbed, outturned, and outranged anything America could send against it. Everywhere the Zero appeared, Allied planes burned. At the same time, on Long Island, in a cluster of squat grey factories beside the Atlantic, a new machine was taking shape. Heavy, blunt, homely, the engineers at Grumman were told only one thing: build something that brings our boys home alive. The first time test pilots saw it roll from the hangar, they laughed. It looks like a bulldog with wings. That bulldog would soon change the war. In the spring of 1943, Japan's naval command still believed it held the advantage. The Zero had carried them from Pearl Harbor to the Solomons. Even after Midway's shocking losses, many senior officers convinced themselves that Japan's warrior spirit outweighed American industry. Factories could build airplanes, they said, but not courage. That illusion was already cracking. Across the ocean, American shipyards had learned to weld steel by the mile. Aircraft plants in California and New York ran 24 hours a day, turning aluminium into wings and engines. Each month, hundreds of new carriers slid down the slipways. And inside one of those factories, a new naval fighter, the F6F Hellcat, waited for its test flights. When the first Hellcats arrived on carrier decks in the summer of 1943, they looked almost oversized. The plane was more than a ton heavier than a Zero, with armor around the cockpit, thick self-sealing tanks, and a massive Pratt & Whitney radial engine. Pilots who had survived the fragile Wildcat climbed inside and for the first time felt safe. It could dive faster, absorb punishment, and fire 6.50 caliber Brownings in long, steady bursts. One pilot later wrote, "It wasn't elegant, but you could throw it into a fight and it would fight back." The first encounters came over the Solomons. Japanese veterans, flying their familiar silver Zeros, spotted the dark blue shapes and assumed the Americans had brought heavier bombers. They rolled in, confident. Then the Hellcats turned into the attack. Where the Zero relied on tight turns, the Hellcat relied on power. It could climb like an elevator and dive like a hammer. When the two planes crossed paths, the Zero twisted inside its opponent, only to find the Hellcat had already vanished above it. Seconds later, the American fighter came roaring down in a vertical dive, guns flashing. The first reports that reached Rabaul confused commanders. New American fighters, behaving unlike anything they had faced. Through the remainder of 1943, these encounters multiplied. American squadrons learned quickly. They stopped trying to dogfight and began to dictate every engagement. The lesson was simple. Altitude is life. Speed is advantage. By holding both, the Hellcat could choose when and how to fight. It wasn't a duel of agility anymore. It was a contest of energy and discipline. In Tokyo, analysts dismissed the reports as exaggerations. They called the new fighter a larger Wildcat, heavier, slower, nothing to fear. But combat records told a different story. Zeros were dying in climbs, especially in head-on attacks. Japanese pilots began noticing something they hadn't seen before. American fighters returning to the same airfields day after day, the same pilots alive. The real shock came from numbers no one could see from the cockpit. America's training system was producing pilots faster than Japan could bury its own. By 1943, the United States had graduated more than 60,000 naval aviators. Japan could manage only a fraction of that. A Zero lost with its veteran pilot was irreplaceable. A Hellcat lost was replaced machine and man within weeks. The tide of arithmetic had begun to turn. On one small island airstrip in the Marshalls, Lieutenant J.G. Alex Vrasiu prepared for his first combat sortie in a Hellcat. He was 24, impatient, and barely 2 years removed from flight school. Across the sea, veteran flyers of the Imperial Navy's 201st Air Group were climbing to meet him. Many had fought since China, men with 5 years of experience in combat air patrols. They expected to teach another American lesson. Instead, they met a fighter that refused to fall apart when riddled. Vrasiu downed multiple attackers that day and returned with bullet holes in his wings and oil on his canopy. His after-action report summed up the new reality. She took the punishment and still brought me home. By late 1943, fragments of captured wreckage began reaching Japanese engineers. They studied the armor plates, the thick propeller blades, the massive engine mount. The Hellcat was crude by their standards, too heavy, too simple, but it was survivable. One engineer wrote privately, "They have traded grace for strength, and perhaps that is the wiser path." Within Japan's Air Command, two worldviews clashed. Admiral Kusaka, an old hand from the carrier cargo, argued that superior spirit could still prevail. He warned that Japan must strike harder before the Americans learned to use their new aircraft fully. Others, younger officers who read the reports, saw a deeper danger. They realized that the Hellcat was not just a fighter, it was evidence of a production machine beyond anything Japan could match. For every factory they built, America had 10. For every skilled machinist Japan trained, America trained hundreds. And still, the Americans were designing the next generation, even as the current one entered battle. As 1944 approached, the Pacific sky grew crowded with blue wings. From the Gilberts to the Marshalls, carrier task forces sailed with decks packed in rows of Hellcats. Each was a flying statement. The industrial giant had fully awakened. For the men of the Imperial Navy, it meant that every mission would now be flown into a storm that never seemed to end. By January 1944, the reports crossing Admiral Toyoda's desk in Tokyo were impossible to ignore. Kill ratios that once favored Japan were reversing. Entire squadrons were vanishing in single engagements. Pilots complained of opponents that climbed like devils and absorbed gunfire without falling. Still, official communiques spoke of glorious victories. The illusion, though cracked, persisted. One intelligence officer scribbled a note in the margin of a report. "If these numbers are true, then the sea of clouds no longer belongs to us." He did not show the note to anyone. The Americans, meanwhile, were preparing for the next leap. New radar sets guided intercepts beyond sight. Fleet carriers coordinated through radios that Japanese forces could no longer jam. Each Hellcat now fought as part of a larger mind, the task force itself. The lone hero pilot was giving way to the machine of organization. By the spring of 1944, Japan's most dangerous weapon, The belief that courage could outweigh industry was quietly dying. And in the sky above the Mariana Islands, the final proof was about to arrive. June 1944. The Philippine Sea stretched from horizon to horizon, calm and deceptively empty. Below that stillness steamed the largest carrier force ever assembled, 15 American flat-tops packed with more than 900 Hellcats. To the north, Admiral Gisaburo Ozawa's Mobile fleet advanced from the Marianas, confident that one decisive blow could still change the war. He had more than 400 aircraft. Many were piloted by boys barely out of flight school. It would be the last time Japan's carrier air arms sailed in strength. In Tokyo, few understood how radically the equation had shifted. Japan still possessed the mythology of Midway, the idea that a single daring strike could offset every disadvantage. But in the years since, America had turned its factories into a war machine of breathtaking scale. For every Zero built in Nagoya, 6 Hellcats rolled off assembly lines in Bethpage, New York. For every pilot Japan graduated, America trained 10. The difference was no longer tactical, it was civilizational. On the night of June 18, U.S., Task Force 58 prepared for contact. Flight decks glowed under red battle lights as armorers loaded ammunition belts. Pilots sat in ready rooms, silent except for the hiss of ventilation fans. Each knew the next dawn might decide the entire Pacific campaign. One veteran wrote later, "We didn't think about victory. We thought about getting back to the ship." The first wave. Dawn broke pale and brilliant. Radar screens flickered, contacts dozens, then hundreds inbound from the west. Controllers barked vectors, engines thundered to life. Within minutes, Hellcats filled the sky in layered formations. They weren't improvising. They were executing a system. Fighter directors aboard picket ships used radar to guide squadrons into precise intercepts long before the enemy could see them. At 10:36 a.m., the first clash erupted 50 miles out. Japanese formations, scattered and climbing, met disciplined American divisions diving from above. The result was chaos, blue arcs slicing through sunlight, tracer streaks, tumbling smoke. Within minutes, the Zero's old advantage, its effortless turn, no longer mattered. Speed and coordination ruled. By noon, the sea below was littered with wreckage and the faint glimmer of parachutes. The great MAI-NAS turkey shoot. American pilots would give the battle its grim nickname later. Claims varied. 300, 400 enemy planes destroyed in a single day. Historians still debate totals, but no one disputes the outcome. Japan's carrier air arm was shattered. Many of its best pilots died in those few hours. The survivors returned to decks half empty and fuel-starved. Lieutenant Alex Vrasiu, the same young pilot who had tested his Hellcat months earlier, shot down 6 attackers in 8 minutes that morning. He landed with ammunition to spare. When asked how, he answered simply, "They came in straight and level. We had altitude and radar. We just did our job." On the other side of the battle, radio reports reached Ozawa's flagship one after another, squadrons not answering calls, aircraft failing to return. By nightfall, he knew the truth. Japan had lost its last chance to contest the skies. The Mobile fleet retreated west under cover of darkness. It would never again threaten the American advance. Aftermath. In Tokyo, the War Ministry waited 24 hours for confirmation, then received the coded summary. Aerial losses severe. Enemy air power overwhelming. Operations suspended. No elaboration. For younger staff officers who had studied at Western academies, the message was devastating, yet unsurprising. They had warned that without fuel, training, and radar, courage alone could not win a modern war. Now their fears were proven correct. General Anami, still insisting spirit could triumph, refused to concede defeat. He ordered increased production of interceptors and urged pilots to fight to the last. But behind him, industrial statistics whispered a different story. Japan's aviation fuel reserves were measured in weeks. America's were measured in oceans. The numbers that ended the dream. By mid-1944, the United States had built more than 6-0 Hellcats, nearly as many fighters as Japan had produced in the entire first 3 years of the war. Factories delivered one every hour. Each carried the same rugged airframe, the same engine, the same parts that could be swapped between squadrons without hesitation. Maintenance crews loved it. Pilots trusted it. Commanders could plan with it. Japan, by contrast, was running out of aluminium, copper, and trained mechanics. Planes left assembly lines unpainted to save time and material. Engines failed after a few dozen hours. In the air war's arithmetic, small inefficiencies became mortal wounds. The turn in mindset. Even among Japanese flyers, perception began to change. Pilots who had once dismissed the heavy American fighters as clumsy now spoke of them with a mixture of respect and dread. They noticed that when a Hellcat was hit, it often kept flying. When a Zero was hit, it burned. One veteran later recalled, "We still thought we could match them in courage, but we could not match their machines." Meanwhile, American squadrons evolved from cautious rookies into a confident brotherhood. They joked that their airplane was a wildcat that ate too much, but behind the humor lay trust. A pilot might walk away from a crash, patch the plane, and fly again. That kind of survival built momentum, the quiet, relentless morale of men who knew they would probably see tomorrow. The logistics revolution. What truly doomed Japan's air power wasn't the Hellcat alone. It was the ecosystem that surrounded it. Fleet oilers refueled carriers at sea, creating mobile bases that never needed to retreat to port. Repair ships replaced hangars. Radar pickets extended vision hundreds of miles. Each victory fed directly into the next operation. It was industrial warfare perfected, invisible but irresistible. Japanese planners had once believed distance would protect them. Now that distance worked against them. Every island lost became a new American runway. Every Hellcat launched from it shortened the approach to Japan itself. The human cost. For the pilots, statistics offered little comfort. Even on the winning side, combat was brutal and brief. The Pacific's Blue Beauty hid sudden death, mechanical failure, flak bursts, ditching in vast emptiness. Those who survived long enough to see the war's end spoke later, not of glory, but of relief. One said, "We started the war believing we'd prove ourselves. We ended it hoping only to live." On the losing side, despair deepened. Letters recovered after the war show young aviators writing farewells before each mission, aware their chances had dwindled to nothing. They flew anyway. In that courage lay tragedy, not fanaticism, the human determination to finish a task even when the outcome is known. A new understanding. By late summer 1944, Japan's surviving commanders faced an unavoidable realization. The war in the air had become an equation of steel and fuel, not valor. They began shifting focus to defensive preparations, conserving aircraft for what they called the decisive battle over the homeland. But the momentum had already passed beyond recovery. For America, the victory in the Philippine Sea confirmed something larger. The Hellcat was not just a weapon, it was a proof of concept. That disciplined production, organized logistics, and collective learning could overwhelm any opponent, however skilled. The United States had found its rhythm of war, and nothing would slow it again. Epilogue to the battle. When Task Force 58 anchored to refuel after the engagement, pilots stepped onto deck stunned by the scale of what they'd done. Some celebrated, others simply sat in silence. The ocean was calm again, as if nothing had happened. But from that moment, the Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to be an air power. The Pacific had changed hands. Autumn 1944. The Pacific War had become a straight line pointing toward Japan. Each island taken became another runway, another refueling stop, another base from which the blue-winged Hellcats could launch again. The aircraft that had been mocked as overweight now filled the horizon like a tide. In October came the largest naval engagement in history, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. When Japanese bombers appeared over the invasion fleet, the interceptors waiting for them were almost entirely F6Fs. They tore through the formations with mechanical precision. For the first time, American admirals ordered their carrier groups to operate without fear of serious air attack. What had been a duel of equals in 1942 was now pursuit. The end of the carrier war. Japan still possessed carriers, but most sailed without trained air groups. Some launched obsolete planes, flown by men who had never landed on a deck before. When these squadrons rose against Hellcat combat air patrols, they vanished. By the end of the Leyte fighting, the Imperial Navy's carriers were floating decoys. The age of the Japanese carrier force ended in smoke and silence. On one surviving flight log, an American controller scribbled the tally for the day. Enemy contacts, 30. Hellcats returning, 30. No comment, no exclamation point, just the quiet routine of dominance. A shift in warfare. Yet victory carried its own cost. For pilots on both sides, the war had become impersonal. There were pieces in vast systems, radar networks, production lines, convoy schedules. The beauty and terror of individual dogfights were being replaced by mathematics. American flyers began noticing the new enemy tactics that would haunt the final year, special attack missions. Young Japanese pilots, often barely trained, dove their aircraft directly into ships. Hellcats scrambled to intercept, and for the first time, the American crews felt something close to pity. The opponents they once respected, as masters of the sky, were now sacrificing themselves because their nation could build no more machines to fight for them. One Hellcat pilot later wrote, "We were shooting at courage itself." The final advance. By early 1945, the Hellcat was everywhere. It escorted bombers over Iwo Jima, strafed airfields on Okinawa, and hunted supply convoys across the South China Sea. Newer American fighters, the sleek F-4U Corsair, the twin-engine P-38 Lightning, joined the battles, but the Hellcat remained the Navy's dependable workhorse. Factories on Long Island had built more than 12 Zero of them. They rolled from assembly lines like automobiles, identical down to the bolt. It was industrial warfare distilled, the same design, repeated perfectly, backed by oceans of fuel and fleets of tankers. Japanese intelligence reports read like obituaries. Entire air regiments listed as non-operational. Fuel reserves measured in days. Pilots trained on wooden mock-ups because engines were too scarce for practice. The Zero, once the symbol of Japan's modernity, was now an artifact of an earlier world, graceful but out of time. The lesson revealed. Inside the Japanese High Command, a few officers spoke the truth aloud. They understood that the enemy's strength lay not in any single aircraft, but in the system that produced it. The Hellcat was proof of what organized democracy, industrial planning, and scientific coordination could accomplish. One colonel, writing in a private memorandum later, recovered after the war, concluded, "We fought believing the sword could overcome the forge. We discovered that the forge builds swords without end." The last missions. Spring 1945. Over Okinawa, the sky was crowded with chaos. Thousands of aircraft, tracers, smoke. Hellcats patrolled endlessly, intercepting raids before they reached the invasion fleet. They shot down attackers by the dozen, but they could not stop them all. Ships still burned, men still died. Even victory exacted a terrible price. By the campaign's end, the Hellcat's score sheets listed astonishing numbers, more than 5-0 aerial victories credited across the Navy and Marine Corps. Historians would later debate exact figures, but not the outcome. The F6F had destroyed Japan's ability to contest the air. When the last Hellcat patrols circled over a quiet Tokyo Bay in August 1945, they found no opposition. The Zero, which had once ruled these skies, was gone. The silence after. On August 15, Emperor Hirohito's voice came over the radio, announcing surrender. For American pilots sitting on carrier decks, the sound was distant, almost unreal. They had lived for months on adrenaline and routine. Suddenly, the war ended in a sentence. One pilot remembered looking at his aircraft and realizing it would never fire its guns again. He felt relief and then emptiness. Across the sea, surviving Japanese airmen stood among wrecked hangars and listened to the same broadcast. Some wept. Others felt only exhaustion. They had fought for years in machines that could no longer keep up, yet they had flown anyway. In that shared fatigue lay the smallest bridge between enemies. Under occupation. After the surrender, American officers toured the ruins of Japanese air bases. They saw the ingenuity of the Zero's design, the careful craftsmanship, and the desperate improvisations of the final months. Even in defeat, there was respect. The visiting engineers measured, photographed, and quietly admired. One wrote in his notebook, "They built beauty when they needed steel." At the same time, Japanese scientists visited American hangars and saw the Hellcat up close. What struck them most was not power, but simplicity, panels that could be removed in minutes, wiring that could be repaired with basic tools, engines designed for mass production rather than perfection. The lesson was plain: perfection is fragile, simplicity endures. What remained? In the post-war years, many surviving Hellcats were scrapped or sold for parts. A few became training aircraft, their gun ports sealed, their armor stripped. But for the men who had flown them, the sound of that engine remained unforgettable. The deep, confident roar of a machine that could take punishment and still bring its pilot home. For Japanese veterans, the sound carried a different memory. The moment they realized the war had turned irreversibly against them. Yet even some of them, interviewed decades later, spoke without bitterness. One former Zero pilot said, "We were defeated by a nation that learned faster than we did." There is honor in recognizing truth. The true meaning of the Hellcat. The Hellcat's legend was not built on aces alone, or on its kill ratio, or even on its rugged design. Its meaning lies in what it represented, the triumph of adaptation over arrogance, of learning over tradition. It showed that technology is only as strong as the system that sustains it, and the humility that improves it. America's engineers had built a machine to save lives, not just take them. Every sheet of armor, every drop of self-sealing fuel was an act of protection. That mindset, preserving the pilot, proved as revolutionary as any weapon. The shared heritage. When peace returned, former enemies met again, not in cockpits, but in conferences, museums, and air shows. They spoke of engines, tactics, and weather, not ideology. A few American veterans visited Japan to pay respects at memorials for lost airmen. They found, in those quiet places, that the difference between pilot and opponent had always been smaller than propaganda claimed. One elderly Japanese flyer, meeting an American Hellcat ace in 1970, bowed and said softly, "Your machine was strong, but your system was stronger. Teach us how to build such systems." The American replied, "We're still learning too." Epilogue, the sky that belongs to all. Today, a handful of F6F Hellcats still fly. Their paint gleams deep navy blue, their engines thunder over peaceful fields. When they lift off, the sky that once divided nations becomes shared air again. Spectators look up in awe, hearing not the noise of war, but the echo of history's turning point, the moment when courage met industry, and both learned from each other. The Hellcat story is not just an American story or a Japanese tragedy. It is a reminder that belief without understanding leads to ruin, and that respect born from conflict can outlast the conflict itself. Every roar of that old radial engine carries a single truth. Strength is not in domination, but in learning.